Can you hear me? Okay, now you can. There's a little bit of a delay on here, so thank you all so much for coming out. Wonderful turnout. We really appreciate it, and we appreciate your wanting to seek out knowledge on this particular subject. I'm Jill Nadeau. I'm the president of the AAUW, and we're trying to focus our talents on this issue this year. So like I said, we're really happy to see you here. For members who are here, just a reminder that our first educational subcommittee meeting will be November 12th at 6:30 at the Blue Review rehearsal space. No leotard required, so good to go. I was also asked to do a short announcement here from Social Justice Watertown. They are having a educational evening here on November 5th, and it's for anybody who wants to, is thinking about running for office. So it's going to be kind of a running for office 101 kind of a thing. So it's a kind of an intimidating thing, but I think we all know that all it takes is enthusiasm, really, right? So my main thought here is to introduce you to Dr. Julie Mead. She is a professor emerita in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Legal aspects of education are the focus of Dr. Mead's research, writing, and speaking, specifically targeting issues related to special education and those raised by various forms of school choice. Dr. Mead is well-versed in the history of public education and the role elected public officials play in the formation of educational policy. And there will be time for questions after she finishes her presentation. So let's hear it for her.
Thank you, and I'm going to have to, you'll excuse me, I have a timer set so that I don't go too long, which is easy to do because I'm a professor and I can talk for a very long time. Most of my classes were 2.5 hours long, but I promise I won't do that to you. Okay, I said it wrong. Here we go. Okay. All right. So I was asked to talk about really the relationship between democracy and public education. And so what I'd like to do is kind of go or talk about these three questions. Think about these three questions. So what are the values and principles that make public schools so essential to a strong democracy? How do we describe and defend those values when supporting our public schools? And then I was also asked to talk to you a little bit about how Wisconsin school funding works, because a lot of what we understand about what needs to happen comes from when we think about funding. So let's start there. And as I was mentioning to some people before we started, a lot of what I have to say probably will not sound new. It will sound real familiar, I hope it will. But I may give you just a different way to frame things or a different way to think about things. Although when we get in the funding part, hang on, right? So here we go. So people, our ancestors, famous and not famous, have long understood the relationship between democracy and education. And one of the things to keep in mind is, because we forget about it, we take it for granted, how very, very radical our Constitution, our federal Constitution is. It starts with the words, "We the people of the United States." That had never happened before. That was amazing. This notion that a government would only exist with the consent of the governed. That was a really interesting idea. And so this notion that if we're going to have the governed, right, the consent of the governed, be part of the government, then everybody needs to understand our system and what's happening. So this notion that an educated citizenry is a vital requisite. So that starts all the way back with Jefferson here. I could do many of these, but I just picked a few. Horace Mann, who's often viewed as the intellectual architect of the idea of public education, wrote, Education then, beyond all other devices of human origin, is the great equalizer of the conditions of men, the balance wheel of the social machinery. The public school is the greatest discovery by man. So that whole notion that you would bring people together from all different backgrounds and educate them together, again, another pretty radical idea. Remember, before the advent of public education, education was solely a family enterprise. If you had means, your children might get educated. If you didn't, they might not have any formal education at all. So this notion of a public education system, again, was another really interesting idea. You also can't separate it from that idea of freedom. So this is a favorite quote of mine from Frederick Douglass, which really connects that idea of education and freedom. That if we're going to be free as a free people, we need to be an educated people. And from our last century, Mary McLeod Bethune talked about again that this is the world's most colossal democratic experiment. Again, that idea of bringing people together. You heard that school law is my thing, so I can't resist, of course, not including what our Supreme Court said in Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954. And notice again everything that they're talking about there. Compulsory school attendance laws and the great expenditures for education both demonstrate our recognition of the importance of education to our democratic society. It is required in the performance of our most basic public responsibilities, even service in the armed forces. It is the very foundation of good citizenship. But even with all of that, and you might say all of the kind of studying I've done, the person probably who's influenced my thoughts on public education the most is that guy. That's my dad, Wilson Henry Fisher. Yes, that's from my high school yearbook, so I'll let you guys do the math. Long time ago. But Dad was, actually he was president of the school board the year that I graduated. And so I watched Dad. I'm 7th of 8 kids. So Dad certainly had a vested interest in what was happening at school, but he was also really, really vocal, as was my mother, frankly, around that dinner table, talking about the importance of education and the importance in particular of public education. And so I watched him with his great big binders when he would prepare. And in thinking as I was putting these thoughts together, actually several years ago now, there's a tendency for people to talk about public education as an issue of funding alone. But that's not the only thing that makes public education public education. And so when I think back to the lessons I learned around the dinner table from my dad, what I think about is actually that publicness, what's public about public education, has 5 aspects. And I promise I'll go through these, but they are public purpose, public funding, public access, public accountability to communities, and public curriculum. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let's start with the first one, public purpose. This is the recognition that it's not a private enterprise alone. Of course, I have an interest in how my 3 daughters were educated, but I also have an interest in how my neighbors' kids are educated. And I still have an interest in that, even though my kids are all grown and done with formal education. I have an interest in how people around me are educated because we're all in this together. I had to go and have my tires fixed the other day. I have no idea how to fix a sensor in my tire. I rely on somebody to know that and to figure it out. And thankfully, the person was very kind and did that for me, and it was all good. But I depended on that person's education, right? When I go to the doctor, there are all kinds of things, but we all depend on each other, and so we all benefit from an educated citizenry. That was that recognition that started that whole horseman movement in public education, that we all benefit when we're all educated. And because of that, it's essential to the democracy, and it's part of the commons. It's part of what we do together, like building roads, fire departments, police departments, right? There's all kinds of things that are part of the commons, And public education is part of that commons too. And in fact, that recognition that public education is central is really, really interesting, I think, when you start talking about constitutions. And I know it's kind of, you think of parchment, right, and all that stuff. The federal Constitution doesn't mention the word education, but remarkably, all 50 states do. And I think, again, remember what a constitution is. It is the document by which a people, here, the people of the state of Wisconsin, say what their government is and is not, what it can and cannot do, what it may and may not do, right? That constitution is really important, and that the fact that all 50 states have determined that a primary purpose of state government is public education is really, really telling. How do they do that? Well, in provisions in their constitution. So here's an example from Florida. You're like, Julie, we don't live in Florida, but I want to show you just some examples of language. The language, of course, depends on when it was written and all of that kind of thing, but you need to pay attention to those words that I put in red. Shall, right? Adequate provision shall be made, not if we feel like it. Shall. That's really important. It's something that's been a constitutional obligation on the part of the legislature. Indiana, same thing. It shall be the duty of the General Assembly. And then notice where tuition shall be without charge and equally open to all. That notion, that idea is central to education in all 50 states, including our own. Here's Wisconsin's language, Article 10, Section 3. The legislature shall, again, there's that word, provide by law for the establishment of district schools which shall be as nearly uniform as practicable. Say that 3 times fast. And of course, we've been arguing about what that means, and such schools shall be free and without charge for tuition to all children. That's really, really important, this notion that we have a constitutional basis in our state and in other states for public education. It is an obligation on the part of the legislature. It's not a discretionary action. There's lots of discretionary actions that the government can take, that the legislature can take to promote the general welfare, right? But this is not one that they can decide they don't want to do. The Constitution directs that they shall. So there's our public purpose. So how do we do that? Well, we invest together through public funding. I'm going to talk a lot more about the ins and outs of funding later, but it's really important to think about it that way, that the reason that we have public funding is because it is a constitutionally mandated expenditure. We must. Constitution says so. Now you're right, Constitution is a document of the people. So if the people got together and decided to strip that language out of the Constitution, they could. But unless and until we amend the Constitution, that's part of our Constitution. It's a primary purpose. Public access then means that public schools serve everybody. We're not saying, oh, public only means this people or that people. It means everybody. And it also is this notion of a common school experience. That was that whole idea of bringing people together from all different kinds of thinking into one place to have that experience. So, as my grandmother used to say, you can learn to disagree without being disagreeable. Anybody else's grandma say things like that? So that idea that public access, and if you were to come take a school law class with me, we would go through actually a whole host of Supreme Court decisions over time that at their base were all arguments about, aren't I part of public too? Shouldn't public apply to me? Aren't I part of public? And the Supreme Court iterating over and over and over again, yes, you are. Public, in fact, means everybody. And then in addition to, of course, the Supreme Court's notions, then Congress, through provisions, both in their Article 1 powers, but also in the 5th section of the 14th Amendment, have created a whole host of laws that codify this idea that public means everybody, that we will leave no one out. And so as you can see there, you've got the first trio, the Americans with Disabilities Act, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and the Individuals with Disabilities Act, all guarantee rights to kids and grown-ups with disabilities. Title 6, do I have 6 first? Yeah, 6. It protects students and staff from discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin. Title 7 of the Civil Rights Act applies to discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. That's in employment. Title 9 applies, protects on for discrimination on the basis of sex. And then the Equal Educational Opportunities Act is race, color, sex, and national origin. Now you'll notice that some of those have underlined recipients of federal funds. That's because those laws then, only apply to entities that get federal funds. They're really what I call stick acts. They say, you know, if you're going to take our money, you can't do one of these bad things. And if you do this bad thing, you can't have federal money anymore. That's really what those laws are all about. But keep that in mind, because when I talk a little bit later about some of the issues around privatization, those laws don't apply in private spaces if they don't receive federal funds. And in fact, I'm going to shock you a little bit. A lot of this thinking comes out of the 14th Amendment and what we call the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. That doesn't apply to private spaces either, because it requires what we call a state actor, somebody connected to the government, in order to trigger those protections from the 14th Amendment. Going on then, public accountability to communities. We elect our neighbors. I remember very vividly the first time Dad ran for the Supreme Court, listen to me, don't do that, for the school board in my little town. It was exactly tied when they counted the votes. So they recounted them, it was tied again. And so you know how he got it? That's exactly right, they flipped a coin. He let his opponent call it, but he won the coin toss. And that was the first time he was elected. He was elected several times after that. But the notion is that we hold schools accountable by the people that we elect. And in fact, in our system, even though education is predominantly a state and local matter, everybody we elect, so from your school board to people in the state assembly, to your superintendent of public instruction, to your governor, to the people who represent us in the United States Congress, to the president, they all have a role in educational policy formation. All of them do. And so we can hold them accountable by voting for people who have the ideas that we think are appropriate about education, and of course voting for somebody else if we think somebody that's in that position doesn't have the right ideas. We also hold people accountable then by the laws and policies that are enacted. And to give you an idea, so how are we holding public schools accountable? Well, I'm not going to go over all of these with you, but just to show you an sampling, those are federal laws that have something to do with public education and more. And actually, if we went into state law, there's even more. All of those laws are ways in which we hold public schools accountable. It also sets what we call baselines. So my grandma, that I already mentioned, was a school teacher in a one-room schoolhouse between Janesville and Edgerton. And Grandma was very proud that she could become she became a teacher because she took a test in the early 1900s. She was 16 years old, that's how old you had to be. You had to be 16, and you had to take a test, and if you passed the test, you could be a teacher. That's what Grandma did. Over time, though, we said, that's not good enough. So we have a minimum standard of what's okay to be a teacher, right? And that's so that, you know, at that time, at Grandma's time, parents would have to figure out, well, how does this teacher, how is this person trained? What do they know? How do we know they know what they know, right? And then over time, we lifted that baseline. So now, of course, we require a bachelor's degree. We require student teaching. We require training in child development, child psychology, pedagogy, classroom management, all kinds of things, not to mention your subject matter knowledge. So all of those things are ways that we've raised that baseline, but it also means that somebody as a parent doesn't have to vet every teacher their child comes in contact with, because they know that they have to have met that minimum standard that our elected officials have put into law, right? So what do these provisions do? They establish baselines, they set direction and expectations, they prescribe some actions, you will do this, and they proscribe other actions. You will not do that. For example, corporal punishment is prohibited in the state of Wisconsin. It's, believe it or not in all 50 states, but in the state of Wisconsin it is prohibited. So that's proscribed. Even if somebody says, I think it's a really good idea and I think it will work. Too bad, so sad. We as a collective have decided that that is not something that we're going to permit in our public schools. So then we're into public curriculum. So through those same mechanisms then, we decide collectively what it means to be educated, what's to be taught, and what are the standards. And I mentioned earlier, I have 3 daughters, and I'll use them as examples. So between daughter 1 and daughter 2, the state legislature changed the law a little bit. And, I'm sorry, not the state legislature, it was our local school district changed their rules. And so they had to, daughter 2 had to take a personal finance class in order to graduate from high school. Daughter 1 didn't have to do that. So ever so slightly, our school board changed the definition of what it meant to be educated in Middleton Cross Plains School District, right? Between daughter 2 and daughter 3, the local school board added a community service requirement. Again, ever so slightly, changing what it meant to be educated in our community. And also the state legislature instituted the requirement that all kids had to pass a civics exam. Again, changing what it means to be educated in that public school. So we collectively can change a little bit. And I also think back to my own time in high school, eons ago. But my older sister, I have 5 older sisters and an older brother. And, Dad was on the school board, and he really thought that, there was going to be a big problem with my education, because between Don, who's 5 years older than me, and me, these things called calculators were invented. So I learned to use a calculator. I did not learn to use a slide rule, like all my older sisters did, and my older brother, and of course my dad. I played with his all the time, but I had no idea how to use it, and nor did I. But now, would we think that was unusual? No. But we would say, your education probably isn't complete if you don't know how to use a computer. Right? So as time changes, we redefine what needs to be a part of that public curriculum. Here's what our state statute says. The effective operation, as you see there, is dependent upon a common understanding of what public schools should be and do. And then it says, here's some other things that are, and of course if you go into 11801, you'd find there's a whole lot more detail. But you have to give pupils academic skills and knowledge, vocational skills, citizenship, and personal development. So those are those 5 dimensions of publicness. Public purpose, public funding, public access, public accountability to communities, and public curriculum. So how do we defend those values when supporting our public schools? Well, first of all, I think we need to crow a lot more. And also, I think the other thing we have to say is, that was an amazing gift that our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, and probably going back generations even before that, gave to us. Are we ready to dismantle that system? Are we ready to trade away aspects of that publicness? And if we are we sure that that's a good choice? And is it a collective choice? So, how do we defend those? Well, first of all, I think you remind them that public schools serve everyone. Public schools are accountable in all kinds of ways. Public schools make strong communities. We know that, right? Just think about what happened a few years ago with Palmyra Eagle when they were thinking about closing their school district, right? The community was like, ooh, wait a minute. If the school district goes away, what happens to our community? Because there is a connection between the two. Otherwise, realtors wouldn't pay near so much attention to schools, would they? And public schools are the cornerstone of democracy, but also public schools work. Again, the purpose is to make sure that everybody is educated to a certain level, right? So how do we do that? Well, one thing I think you have to pay attention to is occasionally you'll see something that says that there's a comparison between public and private schools, or public and charter school, public schools and charter schools, or public schools and voucher schools. One, just a little research tip, make sure they're comparing apples to apples, because often they're not. And so you have to be really careful about that. But when you have good research, and we have lots of good research, and now, I mean, I think it's interesting, when we first had issues of privatization, the argument was that the outcomes were going to be better for everybody if we went into these and had these kinds of programs, like charters, like vouchers. We've now had over 30 years of research on those topics, and that's not been borne out by the research at all. In fact, research that compares children in public schools to similarly situated children in other settings shows that they do as well or better. So you have to ask yourself, well, are those trade-offs of publicness, giving us what we want? Then the other is that research on voucher programs shows no academic advantage, and has even in some large-scale studies, not in the state of Wisconsin, but in other states, has shown some declines, which is really unusual. So there are a few academics in the room. In educational research, finding a negative correlation is a significant negative correlation is very unusual. And the fact that we have 2 or 3 studies that have found that kids that entered a voucher program in Indiana, for example, Louisiana for another one, actually lost ability in math. They went backwards, not forwards. That's really concerning. This is getting to be an old book now. It's from 2013 from the Lubianskis. They're both at University of Indiana. But they did that apples to apples comparison and using 2 big large data sets, and found that actually when you controlled to make sure that you were comparing similarly situated kids in each sector, that public schools actually outperformed private schools, outperformed charter schools, scored the highest or among the highest in the world when poverty rates were under 10%, and scored among the top few nations of the world when poverty rates were 10 to 25%. Really good book, by the way. It's wonky. I'll warn you. It's a little wonky, but it's cool. As an example of a research study, this is a longitudinal study of kids for 15 years. That's a long time for an educational study. And they found, in fact, that there was no evidence to suggest that low-income children or children enrolled in urban schools benefited from private school enrollment. Public schools are actually doing pretty good. But let's go and dig into funding a little bit. Let me see how, okay, all right, here we go, hang on. So back to that constitutional provision. We have, of course, turned to the courts to figure out what exactly does this mean. And the most recent Supreme Court, Wisconsin Supreme Court case, because Wisconsin Supreme Court is the final arbiter on what the Wisconsin Constitution means. And they found, now this was a 4-3 decision in the year 2000 in Vincent versus Voigt. What's really interesting, though, it's a tangle of opinions where you actually, I had to map it out to figure which justice agreed with which justice on which part, because if I agree on part 3 and not part 2, and it's really a tangle. But what's interesting is that these 2 paragraphs that I'm going to show you, all 7 justices agreed about. That means pay attention to these 2 paragraphs, right? And so those 2, first of all, that constitutional language confers the fundamental right to an equal opportunity for a sound basic education. That's legal speak for really, really important and cannot be taken away without appropriate due process. Then they went on to say, and what's the standard? This is interesting because usually when we're talking about the Constitution, we don't tie in statutes because, in the pecking order of legal authority, constitutions are more important than statutes. But they did here, which kind of has the way of almost locking in what the statute said at the time. At least they can't make the standards lower, maybe higher, but not lower. And so you'll see that they said that opportunity for proficiency in one group of subjects and opportunity to receive instruction in another group of subjects. Moreover, they said that there were 3 special populations that the funding system had to acknowledge in order to make sure that, in fact, schools were as nearly uniform as practicable. So they had to pay attention to students with disabilities, economically disadvantaged students, that's how they term them, and students learning English. Why? Because we know that those 3 populations often require additional instruction. Now, our system, when this was decided in 2000, was only a few years old because it was in the 1990s that our state legislature created the current funding structure. And at that time, they talked about it as being a 3-legged stool. I don't know if any of you remember hearing about that, the 3-legged stool. And the 3 legs were the revenue limits that made sure that districts couldn't spend too much money, the qualified economic offer, which was a way to limit bargaining between teachers' unions and school boards, and third, the commitment of 2/3 state funding. Over time, however, they took away that part of the stool, then they took away that part of the stool, and we're left with that one. So we have a little bit of a problem with our funding structure, and in fact, as I'll mention later, the Blue Ribbon Commission has recommended a whole host of changes starting in 2019, most of which have not been implemented. But let me give you a quick primer on how to understand this. And this is the Julie Mead metaphor way of talking about this. Everybody you're going to hear talk about it is going to talk about it a little different, but this is the Julie Mead method. So imagine that you have a box, and the box is a fixed amount. That's going to represent our revenue limit. This box must be full, right? Most of the time it has to be full, and it's going to be full with 2 kinds of money. State aid, here we're talking about state equalization aid for the most part, although there are other pots, but I won't go into all of those or I'd be here for another hour and a half. And local property taxes. And our system is designed to equalize school funding across districts. So it recognizes that arithmetic sometimes is helpful and sometimes is not. And so if you're a property-rich district where arithmetic is helpful, you can tax yourself at a low mill rate and get a bunch of money, right? So you're less reliant on state aid. Conversely, if you're a property-poor district, arithmetic is not your friend. You can tax yourself at a high mill rate and still not have enough money. And so in that case, there's more reliance on state aid and less reliance on local property taxes. What's interesting to understand, though, is that if the revenue caps are held constant, no more money goes to kids. Doesn't matter how much money might get pumped into the system, if you're not going to increase revenue limits, all it does is shift the proportion of the money in the box. It doesn't change how much money can be spent on kids. There's only 2 ways for the box to get bigger. Either the state legislature raises the revenue limit, or you go to referendum. Think about how many districts, right, have lately gone to referendum. Now, if that weren't complicated enough, you'd say, oh, well, the revenue limit must be the same everywhere. Ooh, no, no, no. Revenue limits were locked in the mid-90s when this was created. And so what the revenue limit is in your district depends on what it was in the mid-90s, how many times the legislature's increased it, and how many times you've gone to referendum. So revenue limits, as you can see there, vary broadly across the state. The average is a little over. This was last year's data just before the increase, so this was in anticipation of the budget. It was a little over 13,000. But something interesting has happened. So again, remember that there are only two ways to make the box bigger. And sometimes the legislature does two really interesting things. One thing it does is it pumps more money into the state aid, but it doesn't make the box any bigger. That really only results in property tax relief. It doesn't result in any more money to kids. The other way they do that is what happened with the last biennium. And that's that they said, okay, you can have a bigger box, but we're not putting any more money into the system. So notice we got a little white space there, and I said, it had to be full, right? So what's the only way to fill it? That really is permission for local school districts to raise your mill rate without going to referendum. Now, each school district, each school board will have to decide whether they should do that or not. But by giving everybody a bigger box without putting any more money into it, that's the only thing that's left. Now, interestingly, in both of those situations, either giving you more money without a bigger box or giving you a bigger box without more money, both of them have the same result. They shift the burden from the collective across the state to the local property taxpayer. And it has a disequalizing effect. So the richer districts are going to get richer and the poorer districts are going to get poorer. Some things to know, just some statistics. We have not caught up to where we were when Act 10, actually technically Act 32 is the money part, happened in 2011. And notice in 2011, up until 2011, the blue and the black lines are pretty much the same. That's because at that time there was a provision in the law that tethered the revenue limit to the consumer price index. And they took that away in 2011. So now, if inflation goes up, it doesn't matter, right? You still have to wait for the legislature to kick in more money. And not only did they take that away, they took away a whole lot of the money to balance that budget, if you remember, the budget repair bill, but they've never caught us back up. So we are now below the national average. We are also below everybody but Iowa in terms of our neighboring states. There we are, right there. And in fact, we are, the proportion of personal income for education funding has also declined. That means that we have a lot more dependency on referendum now because the state legislature has not been putting more money into the system. There are two kinds of referendum. Those are capital ones. That's when you're building something. And then the other one is operating or recurring, which could be either recurring or non-recurring. I'm not going to go into detail on these. Just suffice it to say, if you see an operating referendum, that means we need more money to keep the lights on. We need more money to maintain the status quo. And often that's a status quo after cuts. So local school boards cut a bunch of programs, they cut a bunch of things, and then they go to referendum, not to get back what they lost often, but just to maintain where they are at the cuts, which, as you can imagine, is not a cycle that we want to be in. This slide just shows you that referendum have been all across the state, not just located in one place. And in fact, here are some statistics. These all come from the Wisconsin Policy Forum. So in 24, we had a passage rate of 61.4%. The total number of operating rate referenda was on record 148. That's pretty amazing. Think about that in proportion to the number of school districts. That was just one school year. And in the last 4 years, their last bullet there, referenda passed in 275 districts. We have 420. So that's telling you more than half of our districts have had to go to referenda just to keep the lights on. Other stressors in our current funding system come from declining enrollments. That's just demographics, right? That affects us all. Funding for special populations and privatization vouchers and independent charter schools, those charter schools that aren't chartered by school boards but are chartered by some other entity. For English language learners, we provide virtually no state money for that special population anymore, and it hasn't increased in years. It's a very small percentage, and it's on a reimbursement rate. So if they're getting 8.9% reimbursement, or almost 9% reimbursement, that means 91% of the costs have to be borne by the local district. By design. That's a conscious choice of our state legislature. We have no dedicated state funding source for kids with poverty. We do have federally Title I, although we're all a little nervous right now about whether or not we're going to have that money. But there is no dedicated state source. And as you see there, a large number of districts have high concentrations of kids from impoverished homes. And special education costs have declined. Now that's what that blue line is. The bar graph is how much it costs. And the blue line is how much reimbursement. We're down to a low number of amount of reimbursement. Last year it was just over 30%. The budget has increased it to 42%, but we don't usually get there, and I'll explain why we don't get there. That Blue Ribbon Commission suggested that we have a 60% special ed reimbursement. We're not close. And that we had weighted membership for those two other categories of kids. Those haven't been implemented. So what about another stressor, that privatization? Well, what is privatization? That's this idea that we're going to let a market determine what kinds of policies we have, right? Market-driven policies. In education, of course, it's not just in education, but in education, it usually refers to voucher plans. There's also, not in our state, but there's also things called tax credit scholarships, although there will be one in the federal government if we choose to participate, and education savings accounts. That tells me I have about 3 minutes to wrap this up. Okay, and then charter schools authorized by entities other than school boards. So what's the difference? Well, the biggest difference is voucher schools are private schools that elect to participate in a voucher program. And charter schools are a special kind of public school that's created with a contract between the operator and some state-designated authorizer. Now, both of these things are creatures of state law. What I mean by that is that they are whatever the state legislatures say they are. So a voucher program in Wisconsin is not the same as a voucher program in Arizona. A charter program in Wisconsin is not the same as a charter program in Minnesota. They have the same terminology perhaps, but you gotta look at the details because it's dependent on the statute themselves. Both are voluntary enrollment, but one of the big differences is that on this side, because they're viewed to be public school, federal law that applies to public schools still applies. They may be relieved from state laws, but not from federal laws. On this side, most state and federal laws don't apply, or they apply very, very differently with very different definitions. We have 4 voucher programs. I'm not going to go through the eligibility just because of time, but there are 4. So first was the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program, enacted in 1990. Then the Racine Parental Choice Program in 2011. The Wisconsin Parental Choice Program, the one that's here, in 2013, and the Special Needs Scholarship Program in 2015. One thing I want to impress upon you is not one of those has ever had an up or down vote. Not one. They've all been put into state law in what we call an omnibus bill, usually in a budget bill, where our representatives get one vote. You know, if it's in the budget bill, it's one vote for schools and parks and roads and, you know, everything that state government does, right? And so these new programs were put into the budget bill, but they have never had an up or down vote, nor have we ever had a state referendum where we as voters get directly to say, as some other states have, whether or not to have voucher programs. By the way, every time it's gone to a state, or nearly every time, I think there's one exception now, voters have voted them down, which I think is interesting, sometimes more than once. And you can see that we're now spending almost $700 million on those 4 voucher programs. If the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program were a school district, it would be the 2nd largest school district in the state. How do we fund them? Well, there are formulas for each program. They're funded by a sum-sufficient basis. That's really important because that means whatever they cost, the legislature has said is going to happen. For the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program, it's funded through general purpose revenues. For the other ones, including the one that applies here, it's deducted from the state aid the school district gives. School districts can levy up to the amount of the vouchers, in other words, seek tax dollars to fill in the hole for what they just lost in state aid. But the effects of that are going to vary depending on the number of students participating in your district, the state aid your district receives, and the relationship between the state aid, the district's revenue limit, and the voucher amounts. Because we're not going to make this easy, right? What's also interesting is how does it affect local property taxes? Well, part of the issue is that they've created this new group of kids who are now part of our publicly funded system without providing more money in that pot. So, of course, if you add, if you make the number of people we're dividing by, and we haven't fixed this proportionally, that means there's less money per student, right? That's just back to arithmetic. Just to show you, here is the most recent data for the Wisconsin Parental Choice Program, the one that's here. Notice that less than 25%, about 22% of kids moved from a public school to a private school. Most of the kids were already in private schools or haven't been in school before. And in fact, one thing that DPI has done very well, you can go back and pull up that website if you wanted, and you could look at these reports for every year, and you can see that most of the time, the kids who are taking advantage of this program were never in public schools to begin with. We've just shifted who's funding the kids in private schools. Used to be their parents or a scholarship, now it's the taxpayer. So how does it affect local property taxes? Well, this is just a hypothetical, but the idea is that you take that revenue limit, the box, and the theory goes, well, the voucher is less than that, so you're saving some money. These kids cost less. But you still have to make up whatever the difference is with your local tax dollars from whatever you get from the state with how much that voucher is. And of course, if the savings is this example, the savings is less than the local share, you're still going to have a portion of that your local tax dollars are paying, right? Now this, of course, was, the theory was that was, there was some savings involved, but now we have voucher amounts, particularly the high school voucher, now that's that second line, that's more than the revenue limit for many school districts. In fact, the median, remember, median is the most common, just over 13,000, and you've got that number of school districts, or 254 school districts, at or below the median. That means for those school districts, you may be paying more to send a child to a private high school than you spend to send the child to a public high school in the same district. Watertown, that's your That's your revenue limit for this year. And as you can see, that's less than the amount of the the voucher high school. It's more than the elementary voucher, but it's less than the high school voucher or the special needs voucher. That just shows you how some school districts how much they're paying in voucher payments. But keep in mind that this is the last year that voucher eligibility or enrollment is limited by state statute. Next year there will be no limits in the the Wisconsin Parental Choice program. That's important, as I'll show you in a minute, so keep that in mind. This is how much Watertown is spending. So that's how much was deducted from your state aid to pay for the Wisconsin Parental Choice program and the Special Needs Scholarship program in your community. And remember what I said about there being no limits? You have 43 students who are on the waiting list, so logically, next year you will have a minimum of 43 more students who are being funded publicly in private schools. That's going to be a lot, right? 43 times either 10,877 or 43 times 13,000 something. The special needs scholarship this one, you don't have any income requirements. The Wisconsin Parental Choice program, you do. You have to no more than 220% of the federal poverty level. But you don't for this one. And in fact, they can get the full voucher without, a school can, without showing how they spent the money on the child. If they decide to submit actual cost data to show how they spent the money, they can get 150% of the voucher. If they spend more than that, they can get 90% of anything that they spend over 150% of the voucher. That means that by definition and by choice, the legislature has made sure that any school participating in the special needs scholarship program will get 90% plus. 90% will be the least. Well, they can never get less than, they never get 90. It'll all be 90 plus because you've got 150% of the voucher, 24,000 plus 90% over that. So most of the time they're getting 100% in comparison to public schools who at the most will only get 42% this coming year. What's most shocking, in my view, is that of 204 schools that participated last year, only 8 submitted actual costs. 8. Means 196 schools participated in this program without showing how they used the money at all. At all. They got the money and didn't have to show how they spent it on special needs for that student because the legislature doesn't require them to. The other thing that's important is this notion of some certain. That's what public schools have. That's where the legislature says, here's that pot, divide it amongst yourselves. If you use the pot up, you have to come back and ask for more, right? In contrast, voucher schools are in a some sufficient category. That means whatever it costs, it costs. There's no limitation. So they have whatever is necessary to fund the program. That's a big difference. That's also true of our independent charter schools. For our district charter schools, it's a function of the contract. So that means that if we think of this, who gets money? They talk about the draws. So first, the charter school kids get counted up and $12,369 of state aid would be deducted. And that's, again, some sufficient, guaranteed. Depending on the voucher program and the grade level, you can see the 3 numbers there. Again, some sufficient. Which literally means whatever's left over is what the public school kids get to divide. If you add in charter schools, independent charter schools, that's how much Watertown pays this year. So over $5 million of your state aid is going to those 3 programs. So back to this notion of publicness. As you can see, we're trading away access of those publicness in order to get those voucher programs and the independent charters. And my concern, frankly, is we've never had a good conversation about whether we as a collective think that's a good trade. Maybe we do, maybe we don't. I would like to bring that into the sunshine and have the conversation. And then if we all said, yes, that's a really good idea, okay, I would feel a lot more comfortable with it. But I'm not comfortable with it being inserted into budget bills, and then we never have the conversation. Because all of that is related to democracy. Okay, now your questions.
If a student has a special education voucher, but is no longer in special education, does the school still get a voucher for that child?
Yes, but not as much. So you're right, for a child to be eligible under the Special Needs Scholarship Program, they have to have a current IEP, Individualized Education Program, or a current services program. That means they were pre-enrolled by their parents in the private school and they had an IEP evaluation and they have a services plan in the private school, but they were never in the public school with an IEP. So they had to have one or the other. If after, because we have to reevaluate them at a minimum every 3 years, if after that 3-year evaluation that student no longer meets the statutory definition of what is a child with a disability, the child can stay in the program, but the voucher amount would be reduced to what they would be if they were in the Wisconsin Parental Choice Program. So they'd get the voucher of the other voucher programs, not the higher special needs voucher amount.
I don't do that. I'm a former teacher. I have a good voice.
Okay.
And I will bring this up because I have brought up in many of my master's program classes, especially that have to do with budgets. And I know I'm going to get, because I already do. But I know that many states do this. And I just wonder when Wisconsin is going to start using sales tax to help fund education. Because I don't see this dilemma solving itself, at least for the next 4 years. But what about bringing sales tax?
Well, the sources of income for any school it's all dependent on the legislature. So the answer to that is when the legislature decides to do it. When that'll happen, if that'll happen, I don't have that crystal ball.
The reason why I asked is because I did work in a district that had a significant number of children below that poverty threshold.
Yeah.
In fact, many of the schools were governed that way. But that would alleviate some of those.
It could. I mean, it always, I have a little coin that a student gave me a long time ago, and it's on one side it says maybe, and the other side, if I wanted to flip it, it also says maybe. And that's because the answer is always maybe, 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 maybe. It depends on how the statute would be written, exactly what the details would be, whether or not it would help or hurt. Like any statute, you have to judge it based on its merits and its predicted effect. But maybe.
I don't need it either.
Okay.
I was wondering if you could expand on the pie chart for Watertown and how there's state aid that is going to private voucher schools or charter schools. But I wasn't sure if that relates then to how public schools are essentially becoming pass-through entities for local property taxes to go to voucher schools. Like in our district, it's approaching, and I think now this year, over 10% of our local property tax revenue goes to the private voucher schools, but it's not a line item in anybody's property tax.
No, it's not. It's not a line item. Now, there have been introduced in the legislature more than once, I can't tell you anymore how many times, has been a Transparency Act, which would put that, would strip that out, and so you would see on your property tax, this much is going to Watertown, this much is going to the Wisconsin Parental Choice Program, this much is going to the Special Needs Scholarship Program, this much is going to the Independent Charter School Program, but that's never been allowed to get out of committee. So that has stopped. That kind of transparency, though, there is a movement to add it at least in the notes on property taxes, and Green Bay actually got that passed. So if you went to the Wisconsin Public Education Network, they have a whole thing they call the Voucher Transparency Kit, where they're trying to get that happening everywhere. Now, this is only the amount of state aid, so that's the total amount. And you're right, I didn't do the math, I'm sorry. But you could do the math and figure out what proportion of that comes from the local property tax. And remember that graph I showed you where you have to look at the difference between your revenue limit, the amount of the voucher, and the amount of state aid you get. And that's how you figure out, because you got to fill in the hole. If you're not getting an amount of state aid that's up to where the voucher is, you got to fill in whatever's left with local property taxes. So I can't tell you what the proportion is, but yes, a proportion of that is paid for by your local property taxes. It's a pass-through. Some legislators say, no, it's just a pass-through of state aid. Well, no, because you're not giving me enough state aid to cover that. If you were giving me enough state aid to cover that, in addition to what you give for the kids in the public schools, I could buy it as a pass-through, but that's not what it is. Not now. Go ahead.
Yeah, they recently had a school board meeting with the budget hearing, and the director of finance did a nice job of very specifically delineating, if anyone, it's all recorded on the district website. So it's very interesting seeing, it delineates how much of our property tax percentage is going. It's a slideshow that's in the meeting. So.
Yeah. Did everybody hear that? So your Sarah Kelly, right? Sarah Kelly, your school budget officer, has created a presentation that gives you all of those details. That's wonderful. I should have found that.
And then a survey that just went out.
Yeah. Yes.
Can you explain the Governor Evers 400-year? Where does that fit in?
That was a bit of creativity, wasn't it? That was his attempt to show, because he did a budget, and the 400-year thing was just to make sure that there was at least an increase in what we call the per pupil amount. But we got hammered this year, right? Because essentially what the legislature did is, because they were a little mad at him for that, is that in terms of increasing state aid to public schools, 0 in both budgets of this biennium. 0, nothing. It'll increase the per pupil, which is outside. It's a budget category or an aid category that's outside of the equalization formula. The equalization formula is where the bulk of state aid comes. Then we have categorical aids, transportation aids, some other kinds of aids, right? And then we have this special thing called per pupil, because at some point in the past, people decided, well, we want to give some to everybody. But of course, if you can understand that, that's going to have an even greater disequalizing effect, right? And so that locked in the per pupil amount, but didn't lock in anything in terms of our general equalization aid, and they put 0 for this year and 0 for next year. So, yeah, we'll see what happens. Anybody else?
I have a question about the survey that's going out to the school district. How many people will be receiving that?
A survey for the school district?
So we can get it on for Watertown TV. They're not able to hear that.
Good question. She said, who's going to get the survey? How many?
Excuse me, my understanding is it's going out per household, and that there is a request being made that if you have 2 voting members in your household or more, you can request individual additional surveys, but you have to ask, and they're not telling you that. So from a survey perspective, the statistics can be skewed when you don't have voting people all completing the survey. So ask for as many as you need, but it's going out per household.
That is a pretty big assumption that the whole household will think the same way, isn't it? But there you go.
Just to add to that, you need to call the district office, which is 262-1460. You're going to want to talk to Lynn Linskins, who is the superintendent assistant. Her extension is 3032. Or you can email her at linskinsl@mywusd.org. And please do it now, because if she gets 1,000 calls on the same day, she may not get them out in time. They will all be due on November 17th. So remember, if you have a student who is 18, they can also complete a survey. Don't forget about your adult children, please.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you. I love the crowdsourcing going on here. This is great.
Now, the surveys are supposed to be mailed out October 29th/30th. So I do have some information back here if anybody I just have this one copy if you want to stop and look, because the superintendent is also having listening sessions.
Wonderful.
So this information is also available. So.
Yeah.
Barb, would you write down the email on the table on the way out?
Sure. Yeah, it's right. I got it right here.
Okay. Any other questions that we have? By the way, I have to tell you, this is really impressive. So all of you guys should pat yourselves on the back to come out to listen to a retired professor make a lecture on education on a Thursday night. Wow, I'm really impressed. And it just shows the level of commitment that your community has to education. So kudos to all of you.
Is there a state or public school that's doing really well? I mean, is there a standard that we should be researching or looking at?
Well, I have to be honest with you. That used to be us. Everybody used to look at Wisconsin. I mean, we were a leader in special education. Our law predated the federal law. There are lots of things. Now, I mean, you can kind of guess. I mean, Minnesota's one they look at. Massachusetts is a perennial one that they look at. Again, that one's much smaller than here, so a little different population. Connecticut. What would be another one that I hear of a lot? I'm gonna just stop there because my memory is not pulling one for you, and I don't want to misspeak. But those would be three that people talk about a lot.
Yeah.
Is there a private vouchers, an independent charter school in the Watertown School District, or is that payment for kids who are leaving the district to go to this?
Well, I did not look up your data to see which schools they were going to, so I can't answer that question. I can tell you have 32 students who go to independent charter schools who are resident of your school district.
Watertown High School has a charter school in it.
But that's not an independent charter school. That's a district-operated charter school, which is a different animal. And so that one, in terms of its funding, that's dependent on the contract written between your school board and the operator of that charter school. Yeah. So that's different. The independent charters are chartered by, it could be from, well, there's a limit to the number of online schools, but there's a couple. But you have, well, the Waukesha County Executive has chartering authority. Any UW campus school has chartering authority. The Common Council of the City of Milwaukee, Milwaukee Area Technical College. There's a limited authority for some of the indigenous tribes have some limited authority. Then there's the Equal Educational Opportunity Office. That's UW System. And they can, and if you go online, actually, you can see a list of those independent charter authorizers. And that's usually a slide I show, but I didn't tonight. Most of them have authority to make as many charter schools as they want, anywhere they want. And they don't have to talk to the people who live in that community. They don't have to communicate with the school board. They just have the authority to place a charter school wherever they want. Which, again, I think it begs the question, why do we need another school? Maybe we do, maybe we don't, but we ought to have a conversation, I think. We ought to have a conversation.
I think, to me, one of the things that we we know about all of this, but where do we start? You know.
Where do you start?
Yes.
Okay, don't throw anything at me. Where you start is by talking to your neighbors, and where you start is by voting. Thinking about this when you vote, going to your school board. If you're getting a survey, even if they don't ask you a question about this, if you have an opportunity to write something in there, write something in there. And of course, when April comes around and you get to vote for your school board, think about this whole thing and whoever's running, and vet those candidates to decide which one of those aligns with your view of where you want your community to go. That's number one, but also educate each other. Talk to each other. Come together. I mean, all of the things that you were talking about that you all know that I did not know. I mean, that's a wonderful example of how to get involved.
Do you have more to teach us?
Well, of course I do. I have not given you all of the classes I taught yet. But yes, I could.
Thank you all again, and
Yep.
thank you, Dr.
You're welcome.